Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you've brought us something pretty complex, but absolutely fundamental. We're going to be looking at the neurobiology of psychosis.
That's right, and specifically through the lens of the three big neurotransmitter networks: dopamine, glutamate, and of course, serotonin.
So our mission really is to cut through some of the jargon and trace these pathways. We want to connect the chemicals to the symptoms and understand how we got to our modern view of treatment.
I think it's crucial we start with the basics. What even is psychosis? Because it's not a single illness. It's really a syndrome, a collection of symptoms.
And there's so much stigma attached to it.
A huge amount. Understanding the biology helps us see it as a disruption in brain function, which I think is a much more helpful way to frame it.
Okay, so what are the core symptoms, the ones we're trying to explain with all this chemistry?
The two big ones are delusions and hallucinations. Delusions are these fixed beliefs that just don't change, even with evidence.
Like paranoid projection, the feeling you're being watched.
Exactly. Or grandiose ideas, like believing you have some kind of special powers. And then you have hallucinations.
Perceptions without any actual stimulus.
Right. And while you can have them in any sense, the most characteristic type, especially in something like schizophrenia, is auditory, hearing voices.
The sources also break down how these symptoms can cluster, right? There's paranoid psychosis, disorganized.
Yes, and depressive psychosis. It really is a spectrum. And that spectrum is what started pointing researchers beyond the simple classic theory.
Which was just too much dopamine.
For decades, that was the entire story.
Yeah.
But we now know it's so much more nuanced. It's an interconnected problem between dopamine, glutamate, and serotonin.
So let's unpack that evidence. The pharmacological models are a great place to start. You can see what happens when you push each of these systems in a healthy brain.
It's an incredibly clear comparison. If you introduce a D2 agonist, something like cocaine or amphetamine, you get a very specific picture.
Paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations.
Classic positive symptoms. And, importantly, the person has absolutely no insight. They don't realize a drug is causing their reality to break.
But then you switch the chemical. You block the glutamate system with an NMDA antagonist like PCP or ketamine.
And the picture changes. You still get paranoid delusions, but now you're much more likely to see visual hallucinations. And again, no insight.
The fact that you could cause psychosis by messing with something other than dopamine, that must have been a huge deal.
It was. It proved the dopamine-only theory was, at best, incomplete.
And the third piece of the puzzle is serotonin. What about psychedelics like LSD? They're 5-HT2A agonists.
This is a fascinating one. They cause these very mystical, profound delusions and, again, visual hallucinations. But here's the key difference. The person often keeps their insight.
They know it's the drug.
They know they're on a trip. So the fact that these three different systems, DA, GLU, 5-HT, create three distinct flavors of psychosis is really the bedrock of our modern integrated view.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. So let's dive into that classic system first. Dopamine. How is it made? And maybe more importantly, how does the brain get rid of it?
The synthesis is quick. Tyrosine becomes dopa, dopa becomes dopamine. But the inactivation, how its action is stopped, is wildly different depending on where you are in the brain.
And this is all about the dopamine transporter, the D8.
Yes. In a place like the striatum, which is involved in motor control, you have tons of these DAT pumps. They're like little vacuum cleaners that suck the DA back up almost instantly.
So the signal is very quick, very precise.
Exactly. But if you go to the prefrontal cortex, the PSC, the whole system changes.
Because there aren't many DACs there.
They're very sparse. So without that vacuum cleaner, the brain has to rely on enzymes like COMT and MAO to break the dopamine down.
And that's a much slower process.
Much slower. It allows the dopamine to kind of drift away from the synapse and influence nearby neurons. We call it volume neurotransmission.
So it's more of a broad regional signal than a precise point-to-point one. Now, what about the receptors? I know we split them into D1-like and D2-like families.
That's right. D1 is generally excitatory, D2 is inhibitory. But the D2 and D3 receptors have this really elegant second job. They act as autoreceptors.
A kind of self-regulating thermostat for the neuron.
Perfect analogy. When dopamine binds to a D2 or D3 receptor on the same neuron that released it, it sends a signal to stop releasing more. It's a negative feedback loop.
A chemical break.
Precisely. And the D3 receptor is especially sensitive. It doesn't take much dopamine to hit that break.
Okay, so let's apply all of this to the 4 key dopamine pathways. This is where we connect the chemistry to the actual symptoms and the side effects of treatment.
Let's start with the tuberoinfundibular pathway. Right. It runs from the hypothalamus to the pituitary and its main job is to put the brakes on prolactin.
So when you block D2 receptors there with an antipsychotic.
You release the brake, prolactin goes way up, and you get hyperprolactinemia. Clinically, that can mean things like galactorrhea or amenorrhea.
A direct line from receptor to side effect. What's next?
The nigrostriatal pathway.
Hmm.
This is our big motor control circuit running from the substantia nigra to the striatum.
And this is the pathway that's damaged in Parkinson's disease.
Exactly. Not enough dopamine here causes Parkinsonism. So it's no surprise that when you block D2 receptors in this pathway with medication, you get drug-induced Parkinsonism.
Yeah.
Tremor, rigidity, slowness.
Okay, path number 3. This is the big one for psychosis, right? The mesolimbic pathway.
This is the classic. It goes from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, a key part of the brain's reward system. The core hypothesis is that too much dopamine activity, hyperdopaminergia, in this circuit is the final common cause of the positive symptoms.
The hallucinations and delusions.
Hostility, agitation, all of it. On the flip side, if this pathway is underactive, you might see negative symptoms like apathy or anhedonia.
Which brings us to the fourth and final pathway, the mesocortical. This one connects the VTA to the prefrontal cortex and explains the other side of the illness.
It really does.
Yes.
The leading theory is that hypoactivity, too little dopamine in the mesocortical pathway, is responsible for the really debilitating negative, cognitive, and affective symptoms.
So underactivity in one part of the PFC, the dorsolateral part, links to problems with executive function.
Yes. And underactivity in another part, the ventromedial, links to emotional blunting and apathy.
Okay, this is the moment where it all starts to connect. Because we have one system, the mesolimbic, that's hyperactive, and another, the mesocortical, that's hypoactive. How does a problem with glutamate, the brain's master switch, cause both of these things at the same time?
This is the most elegant part of the whole theory. First, a quick word on glutamate itself. It's our main excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's recycled very efficiently by our glial cells.
But its receptor, the NMDA receptor, is very unusual. It's more than just a simple gate. It's a coincidence detector.
That is the perfect term for it, because for that receptor's channel to open, 3 things have to happen all at once. First, glutamate has to bind. Second, a co-transmitter, usually glycine or D-serine, also has to bind. But even then, nothing happens. The channel is physically blocked by a magnesium ion.
So what gets rid of the plug?
Depolarization. The neuron has to be electrically active enough to literally push the magnesium plug out of the way. When all 3 things happen together, coincidence, calcium rushes in. And that triggers synaptic plasticity or learning.
And the NMDA hypofunction hypothesis argues that this whole mechanism is broken in psychosis. Where does the problem start?
The theory points to a specific failure point: faulty NMDA receptors on inhibitory GABA interneurons, specifically in the prefrontal cortex.
So the brakes on the system are faulty.
Exactly. If the NMDA receptors on these GABA neurons aren't working right, the GABA neurons can't do their job of inhibiting other neurons.
And if you can't inhibit something, you get disinhibition.
Massive disinhibition. The glutamate neurons that were supposed to be kept in check by these GABA cells now become wild and hyperactive.
And these hyperactive glutamate neurons then project down and stimulate the VTA.
Which churns out way too much dopamine into the mesolimbic pathway. And there you have it, the positive symptoms. That single upstream failure in glutamate neatly explains the downstream dopamine hyperactivity.
But how does it also explain the negative symptoms, the too little dopamine part?
This is the brilliant part. The source material shows that while those disinhibited glutamate neurons are exciting the mesolimbic pathway, they run through a different circuit that ultimately ends up inhibiting the mesocortical dopamine neurons.
Wow. So one single fault NMDA hypofunction creates both too much dopamine in the limbic areas and too little in the cortical areas.
It creates the entire dopamine imbalance. It ties the positive and negative symptoms together in one unified theory.
That is an incredible realization. Okay, let's bring in the third player now, serotonin, or 5-HT, specifically the 5-HT2A receptor.
Right. Serotonin is a master regulator. It doesn't just modulate itself, it modulates almost every other major neurotransmitter.
And like dopamine, it has its own set of autoreceptors that act like a gear shift for its own release.
It does. You have 5-HT1A, which is the main brake. Then you have 5-HT2B, which is actually an accelerator, a feed-forward mechanism, and 5-HT1BD, which are the emergency brakes at the axon terminal.
But the real complexity comes from its postsynaptic effects on other systems. Let's focus on that key receptor, 5-HT2A.
The 5-HT2A receptor is excitatory, but its effect really depends on which cell it's on. If it's on a glutamate neuron, it excites it. but it can also sit on a GABA interneuron, where it actually reduces GABA's inhibitory output.
So either way, the net effect of activating 5-HT2A is often more excitation in the overall circuit.
Generally, yes. It creates this very delicate tuning. And this is why it's so clearly involved in psychoses that aren't primarily about a D2 problem.
Like Parkinson's disease psychosis.
A perfect example. In Parkinson's, the disease process kills off some of the serotonin neurons. The brain tries to compensate by putting more 5-HT2A receptors on the surviving cells. They become hypersensitive.
So now even a normal amount of serotonin in that person's brain is causing a massive overstimulation of these upregulated receptors.
You got it. And that overstimulation excites glutamate, which then drives downstream dopamine hyperactivity, and you get psychosis. But it's a different kind, often visual hallucinations, with insight retained, just like the psychedelic model.
And for dementia-related psychosis, is it a similar story?
Similar outcome, slightly different mechanism. In dementia, the neurodegeneration kills off the inhibitory GABA interneurons themselves.
So the system loses its brakes.
The brake lines are cut. The normal excitatory input from 5-HT2A receptors on the surviving glutamate neurons is now completely unopposed. It's all gas, no brake, and that again drives the positive symptoms.
Which explains why treatments that just block 5-HT2A without touching dopamine D2 receptors can be so effective for these specific conditions.
Exactly. You're treating the upstream problem.
So taking this all in, what does this entire picture mean for the classic psychotic disorder, schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is this devastating illness with 5 symptom clusters: positive, negative, cognitive, affective, and aggressive. The cognitive and negative symptoms are often the most disabling long-term.
And we know the cause is this complex interplay between genes and environment.
Absolutely. There are hundreds of risk genes, but environmental stressors, things like trauma or heavy cannabis use in adolescence, can trigger those genes to express themselves through epigenetics.
Which brings us to the course of the illness and these two big ideas, that it's neurodevelopmental, but also neurodegenerative.
The neurodevelopmental idea centers on adolescence, when the brain goes through this massive process of synaptic pruning, getting rid of inefficient connections.
And the theory is that if a synapse is weak, maybe because of that faulty NMDA function we talked about, it gets pruned by mistake.
It gets eliminated when it should have been strengthened. And losing too many of these connections leads to this catastrophic onset of the illness.
But it doesn't just stop there. The illness often gets progressively worse.
And that's the neurodegenerative part. We can actually see brain tissue loss over time. It seems that recurrent, untreated psychotic episodes themselves are toxic to the brain and accelerate this process.
So continuous treatment isn't just about feeling better today. It's about preserving brain structure tomorrow.
That is the critical clinical insight. And we have to remember, psychosis isn't just schizophrenia. The key lesson from all this is that it almost doesn't matter what the initial cause is, a plaque, a genetic flaw. If the damage disrupts that glutamate GABA balance in a way that leads to downstream mesolimbic dopamine hyperactivity,
the result is positive symptoms.
the result is psychosis.
So to pull this all together, the big theories, dopamine hyperactivity, NMDA hypofunction, 5-HT2A imbalance, they're not competing ideas. They all converge.
They all point to that final common pathway of too much dopamine in the mesolimbic circuit driving the most acute symptoms. And that's powerful because it means we can design treatments that intervene at any point in that chain.
The big shift for me is realizing that the location of the circuit damage seems to matter more than the specific cause of the damage.
That's a beautiful way to summarize it.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to really think about. If the strengthening and weakening of our synapses is, as we've discussed, fundamentally activity dependent, what is the profound role that continued mental engagement, learning, and, cognitive practice might play in fighting back against the progressive brain tissue loss we see in these chronic disorders?
It's a question that connects the deepest molecular biology right back to the human journey of recovery. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you feel incredibly well informed. We really appreciate you going on this journey with us. We'll see you next time.